All right. Thank you, Kemi. Thank you, Nicholas, for organizing this and introducing us. We wanted to do a couple of things today. Not just talk about the project as such, but also how we got there and why we're doing this. Basically, setting a bit of the context, and then we'll get at what we did exactly, how we did it, and some of the outcomes. There is still work in progress, but we have some stuff to show you, and there's more coming out of that, hopefully in the coming months. So we'll be able to have a look at this. So it's important to say that perhaps this is one of the reasons why I think the group worked so well is that it didn't come out of the blue, right? It was a bunch of people. Well, it was first Neil and I, but then around us, a bunch of people that had been working together for quite a few years before the CESAB project started. Um, and this, of course, helped a lot in keeping the group together, and especially during COVID, and we'll come to that. Um, but yeah, we've been working with a group of people basically around the intersection between conservation and social justice, and more specifically, social justice in the form of social difference. So basically, how a conservation was taking into account social difference and what kind of effects that had on the ground. And the CESAB project is really a continuation of that, right? It's trying to do a synthesis of a lot of that work by expanding it with a lot, of course, and we'll come to that and how we built the database in a second. I wanted to give you a bit of the context of why that matters in the first place, right? Um, it matters because one of the consequences of the diversity gradient that I don't have to explain here, right? The fact that um, biodiversity is higher along the equator than it is along the poles. One of the consequences of that is that it overlaps with a bunch of social and economic indicators. The first one of which is, of course, income. This is the distribution by the country distribution from the World Bank, and of course, the places where we find most of the biodiversity or where biodiversity is richer overlaps with lower incomes, globally speaking. And so it hints at the need to think about conservation not just as an environmental issue, but one that is closely related with issues of development. And initially, that was understood as in a very narrow sense, as economic development. Um, it also overlaps with um, the presence of indigenous people around the world. This is a map that shows the land that is managed and controlled by indigenous people. And it's been estimated that about 85% of the world's remaining biodiversity is um, controlled in some form or the other by indigenous people. And of course, their ability to do so is weakened by or threatened by weak political, economic, and social rights, which is very important for what is to come in our project. Um, it overlaps with linguistic diversity. There's a co-occurrence of linguistic and biological diversity. You probably know this. It's been estimated at about 70% of all the languages spoken on Earth are located in biodiversity hotspots. This is a very clear relationship between this form of difference, a form of cultural difference in the form of languages, and the remaining species on Earth. And of course, it's closely related to the fact that conservation, as we know it today, is rooted in a very deep colonial history, right? Um, and centuries of colonialism have created a sort of inverse diversity gradient, if you like, by moving species away from where they normally occur. And this map shows the presence or the distribution of ex situ conservation places, like gene banks, botanical gardens, you name it, which are located, as you know, in largely in Western countries, which has led to, of course, a form of what we call in the literature biopiracy, but also a very reductive understanding of conservation that could happen through a sort of ex situ conditions. All of that happens in a context where, as you know, there's been a very rapid growth of conservation and protected areas in the form of protected areas since the 1950s. This graph shows the increase in the total number of protected areas over time, and which is uh, quite ironically one of the few targets of the Convention on Biological Diversity that is systematically being met. All the others are not, but the amount of protected area is growing every year, to the point where global conservation is often reduced to what proportion of the earth to protect. And the latest example was the 30 by 30 discussion, rather than how do we protect and by who is and who's actually leading that protection or that conservation. And yet we know that conserved areas are commonly located in remote areas, a consequence of what I've just shown on the maps, inhabited by marginalized people, and with a high form of social cultural diversity. And so this has led over time to shift from a very strict understanding of nature preservation to what's been called integrated conservation and development, or people-friendly approaches of conservation, which are not necessarily led to uh, benefit local people, even though it could sometimes work for biodiversity. Um, in part because conservation is environmental governance in general is influenced, of course, by culturally specific and disputed ideas of what to conserve in the first place, but also about what works and about what counts as evidence of what works, right? And so the blueprint conservation that is done on a very sort of that is based on a very normative understanding of what conservation should do, has sometimes led to be a source of injustice. And that's why we argue in our work that we need to shift from an understanding of development, of conservation and development, not just as economic development, but as one that focuses on justice and more specifically on the recognition of social difference, right? And this has been captured a bit in the convention since the 90s. There's been, the third objective of the convention explicitly mentions objectives of justice, fair and equitable sharing, for example, and Article 8J that you probably know is specifically about respecting difference, preserving difference, maintaining knowledge systems and whatnot, because it's of importance to, is considered of importance to the conservation of biodiversity. And then in the RG targets, there was a mention of equity as well, even though it took a very long time. And it's been actually very recently that equity has really been defined in that context. And it's not just the CBD, you find it through across the board, basically, the IUCN, in the IPBES conceptual frameworks. In all of these sort of policy-oriented documents, you find mentions of how conservation should take into account conservation, justice, and social equality, right? Um, so what we wanted to do is go beyond just the normative claims for this. This is not just the right thing to do. We argue that it's actually also interesting for instrumental reasons, that it actually improves conservation. But in order to make that claim, we needed to have an actual evidence base. And that's where the the CESAB project comes in trying to provide that evidence base through a sort of large synthesis project. Uh, As I said, there's been some advances at global level in including this idea of justice and social difference. But we've argued in a joint chapter in 2018 that Neil led, that there was a sort of justice gap there, that justice was very present at global level, but it wasn't necessarily at local level. And even when it was, uh, there was a sort of implementation gap and a normative gap, basically, that there was a difference in understanding what that actually meant. in practice. And so there's an obvious need for evidence to give rise to these standards and to improve these standards in practice, and and in understanding what kind of political strategies and conditions are necessary to put that in place in on the ground. And so what we try to do is basically build a synthesis of uh, the knowledge around, broadly speaking, three different components of conservation. One, the motives, basically the why of conservation. Why are we doing conservation? Who's framing the problem? Based on what values are we doing so? How has this evolved over time? As I said, all of these are very culturally specific, even though sometimes we think this is universal. Conservation often comes on a very sort of moral high ground as the right thing to do. And we know that in the past, this has led to very exclusionary forms of conservation that, sometimes we talk about fortress conservation that basically locks up whole protected areas and exclude uh, populations from there. And that, of course, is based on a very specific type of understanding the relationship nature on certain types of values. And so we wanted to try and capture that better through the literature. The second thing we tried to look at was the type of intervention, so the how of conservation. What type of forms of conservation do we find on the ground? The type and design of the interventions, the governance models that were put in place, what they were focusing on in terms of, was it species conservation? Was it ecosystems? Was it livelihoods protections? Was it something else? As well as the practices involved in implementing them. How specifically are we doing species conservation? How are we doing livelihood conservation, et cetera, et cetera? We wanted to get into the nitty gritty of conservation. And then, of course, the output, the what of conservation. Um, what is resulting from the first from the motives and the intervention? What does that produce on the ground? And more than, of course, biological outcomes, more than conserving biodiversity as such, of course, we're interested in what we've called social environmental outcomes, and that included in insights into how successful biodiversity has been, conservation has been, also in terms of justice and the inclusion of certain populations, especially indigenous people, in the stuff we're analyzing. So I'll pass on to Neil, and he'll talk you through how we did so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brendan, and good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming. So, looking at how we went about approaching these questions through a synthesis, we decided that we would review the published empirical science on site-level biodiversity conservation. Other options might have been to look at, for example, the World Database on Protected Areas, existing databases that describe a bit about the how of conservation and some outcomes, or maybe to look at grey literature reports, unpublished reports about conservation in various sites. But we felt they're unlikely to capture the kind of diversity and the depth of critical analysis that we wanted of governance, of the social ecological dynamics, and certainly of outcomes and justice issues related to conservation. So we were looking for a broader diversity than exists in current conservation monitoring, if you like. So, but we were looking, initially we cast our net very wide. So we were looking at a big pool of literature, all empirical studies ever written really about any type of conservation initiative at a local level. So when we did our first search, we came up with just less than 70,000 hits and publications that we would then have to sift through. We seemed fairly, sorry, Brendan, if you just go back to the team. So we seemed fairly unfazed by that at the time. I don't know what kind of numbers other CESAB groups get, but we decided that we were going to try and tackle this problem. And And this is the team that we had together to do that. We were thinking of a long game, really. We wanted a diverse set of group members who brought different perspectives, academics from different disciplines and with different skill sets, as well as people involved in policy and practice, people from IUCN, IED, GIZ initially. We had a couple of Indigenous representatives from Nepal and Kenya as well, who would be able to kind of mold the synthesis we did and also help shape the outputs as well. Now we had that diverse team, and suddenly we found that we had this big, with 70,000 publications to go through, quite a big academic task. And then we also had the lag of the project starting. We initially started putting the team together, I guess, in 2017, and it was about 2020 by the time we were putting the project together. So we then, sorry, Brendan, if you just nip back to the team one, not beyond that quite yet. One of the big adaptations we made was to add the 5 researchers at the bottom there through time. As we had this large academic task, we adapted the team a little bit and brought in 5 young researchers who were working on these issues through PhDs and postdocs, and who were really interested in this large-scale approach to it. And they really were invaluable and brilliant in adding a lot of capacity to the team, especially at the time when we were affected by COVID too. So that was a good change. Thank you, Brendan. So yeah, as you see our timeline, we actually were putting the proposal together in 2017-18 for the project. Didn't really start through until 2020 and were impacted by COVID. Missed about 4 nice weeks in Montpellier through the process, but we managed to change things and meet this task in the end, and eventually came back to Montpellier in April 2022 when we actually had achieved putting this data set together. So then we were able to look at the outputs from that. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the data set that we did put together. As I said, we had just less than 70,000 publications to go through initially after screening, and we used the software Colander, which is a freely available machine learning software that really helped. So we'll talk about that in the next slide. But we still had over 1,000 publications for full review, and that's where the extra capacity of those researchers really helped. And now we got through to that final data set. A further 331 cases were dropped. Our final data set has 723 case studies of conservation from around the world and describes those. And that data set, as you see in the bottom right, there is now freely available on Zenodo for people to look at and find further uses for. And we hope that people do. Perhaps other CESAB groups, it can be useful for Blue Justice and Power Div and maybe other groups as well. Now, I mentioned the Colander machine learning software, which really helped us get through those 70,000 publications. So that was a bit like an extra team member, if you like, using the technology. And Samantha Cheng and colleagues who put this together, I think through the American Museum of Natural History in 2018, were very available for to provide support as we needed it to go through that. And what that does is the software ranks your abstracts and titles for papers based on your previous decisions and looks into keywords that you put in to rank those. And in the end, that meant that we had to screen only 11,000, still quite a lot of papers, but we went through 11,000 rather than the full 69,000. And you can see in the graph is the inclusion rate that climbs as you go on as the software learns your decision making, and then gradually you get to a point where you've creamed off the best of the publications, and we set a limit of 3% of publications per 1,000 for the previous 1,000, at which stage we would stop. So that's where we ended the screening. So a few key characteristics of our data set that make it quite interesting. We're surprised that of those 723 cases of conservation that it describes, the vast majority are in the global south. So you see in North America and Europe, there's relatively small numbers compared to Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Now, this is in direct contrast to the protected area monitoring that we have globally, where the global north countries actually dominating that. So it adds quite a bit of value in that respect. The database also includes a number of different ecosystem types. As usual in these large syntheses, forest and woodland tends to dominate some of the conservation literature, but is less than half in this case, and there's still over 100 papers on coastal and marine ecosystems, for example. So there's a lot of scope to do smaller sub-studies looking into particular smaller samples from our literature. It also spans across quite a broad time set. So 40% of those 723 case studies within the data set are of conservation initiatives that were established between 2000 and 2019, 35% from 1980 to 99, 10% pre-1980, or 4% before 1960. And importantly, on the right-hand side, you see that 10% of the cases are examples of customary governance. So conservation that is being led by local communities where institutions have developed over multiple generations been in place. And that is an element of the data set that's often missing from other forms of monitoring. So it captures a diversity of types. Other main variables within the data set. Now, Brendan set out the questions that we were hoping to answer. One of those was the why, to try to categorize the motives for conservation. And we have to be honest and say that not all of our plans worked. So this was very difficult to categorize from published literature because it's secondhand reporting of scientists about conservation. So it wasn't always included, well, very often not included. So we didn't really have enough data to explore that in much more detail within our data set. What it was much better for was the how part, and it's more objectively reported, I guess, in the types of intervention that are included, and we have a wide range of them. There's the next slide will show the proportions of those within the data set. So also in many sites, there are multiple types of intervention going on. So these are clusters of conservation initiative taking place in a location. Protected and conserved areas being the most numerous, also livelihoods, species protection, forms of local and indigenous stewardship, ecosystem restoration, and these are other means by which the data set could be broken down and explored in further detail as well. Now, the variable that I will focus on now, and I think is the really kind of key value of the data set that we put together, is about governance type, creating categories for the extent of involvement and different roles of indigenous peoples and local communities within conservation governance. And we were able to construct a ladder of categories, a typology that shows different roles indigenous peoples and local communities do play in governance as reported within those studies. And they range from communities being excluded from conservation governance at the bottom through to the top of communities being autonomous and having full control. That also includes the extent of recognition of communities as well, so an extent to which their institutions are included and their rights are respected. So it's a combination of the levels of control and participation within conservation, and also the level of respect for their own knowledge and institutions within that. So, and that all focus on, and that's been the topic of a publication that came out last month in One Earth. We'll talk about more. We also looked at the outcomes, and they were reported in subsamples of the papers within our data set. So not every paper talks about the governance and describes the conservation initiative in much detail, as well as providing the outcomes. So ecological outcomes were provided in 212 of those 723 studies, and social outcomes in 323, I believe, that there are. So that enables you to take sets and do further analyses with those outcomes. So the ecological and social outcomes effectively are response variable for the analyses that we did. We were also able to glean some information on where and how knowledge is produced about conservation. So we looked at the affiliations of lead authors and the types of funding that were provided for those conservation studies. I kind of linked those to the actual study sites. So this is just a bit of a teaser for a study that we hope will be published fairly soon. And you'll see an analysis that I think Laura Minocci, who was working at Cesab at the time of our project, put together. So this Sankey chart shows the continent through which the lead author is affiliated, and then the continent on the right side of where the study is taking place, where the conservation intervention is happening. And you see just from the top, looking at Africa there. So there are 220 case studies within the data set, and less than half of those are described by authors from Africa. The majority of those studies are from lead authors affiliated to institutions in Europe and North America. So this tells us a little bit about how knowledge is produced. Okay, moving on to the outcomes of the project. So this study that was published last month in One Earth, which is the main publication produced thus far, talks about that ladder of roles of Indigenous peoples and local communities I mentioned, and analyzes those against ecological outcomes that were reported to have occurred from the conservation initiative. And this is quite surprising how clear-cut these results are. Both Brendan and I are more used to working in terms of social and political complexity, and especially for this data set where we've brought together 723 different publications, all using different approaches and very different contexts from different parts of the world. We would have expected to see much more noise in these results and have to dig a little bit deeper to see some patterns. But from this slide, you can see that there's quite a clear relationship between the type of role that Indigenous peoples and local communities play in conservation and the outcomes that do result. The green showing that positive outcomes are far more prevalent where Indigenous peoples and local communities are at least treated as equal partners and have respect for their cultures and institutions, and even increasing when they have primary control and autonomy over territories and conservation initiatives. This also holds for social outcomes. You see, social outcomes, positive social outcomes are less prevalent or less frequently reported in studies. But you see this very often where communities are excluded from conservation on the left, negative social outcomes frequently result. And this declines as their their role increases within conservation and the level of respect for their institutions increases as well. So we've had a good response to this paper thus far. It'd be really nice to hear also responses from people who are surprised or disagree with these results in some respects. It would be nice to have those conversations, and for people who maybe feel that strict protection is the way forward for conservation, and feel like, there's elements of these results that people do disagree with. What we're not saying, it's often taken from those results that means there should be a rapid decentralization, and that will lead to a win-win for nature and people. And we're very careful to say in all the publications that there's a need to dig deeper, because that has happened before. I think in the 80s and 90s, there was a big push within conservation for decentralization, community forestry, and where it happens very, very rapidly without the adequate support for local institutions, without the necessary governance qualities in place, it can go badly and lead to poor outcomes. So we say, yes, empowered local communities are the primary pathway to effective conservation, and we show through certain case studies that it requires local qualities like community cohesion, shared knowledge and values, that initiatives are inclusive, avoiding elite capture, that there's effective leadership and legitimate authority there. Because indigenous and local institutions very often have been disrupted through economic policies, extraction, development, modernization trends, and so often require a revitalization and support. It's remarkable. In some cases, a switch can, as the local governance qualities are intact, the resilience of indigenous institutions are quite remarkable in some instances, but often not the case as well. So we tried to illustrate these findings and look in more detail through case studies in the One Earth paper. So we provide examples that show the distinction between the categories and the kind of dynamics at play there to back up that story. I won't go through all those in detail now. And it's not the first time that we found these results. We did a similar study actually through a different search and body of literature. In a paper in Ecology and Society in 2021, I actually found a similarly clear set of results. So it's the second time that we've found this, and still, I would say that there's limited evidence to the contrary. We're not contradicting body of literature with these findings. So it'd be interesting to see if people can produce any. Is it surprising? You think that the level of support of financial resources that go towards stricter forms of conservation, you would think there would actually be a mixed picture relative to the financing that local communities and indigenous peoples do have for their own initiatives, and that might affect results, but doesn't seem to be the case. So this is some of the media coverage of the stories. Thank you to Cesab for helping to disseminate some of that to get it to these places. And so you see, often the media tagline is a very simple interpretation of the story. So it's and that can be taken out of context in the wrong way, just about this line of give all power immediately to local communities. If you moving from the bottom rung of that ladder of exclusion straight to autonomy. But most cases tend to be in the middle rungs of that ladder. And we express that it's perhaps more about finding collaborative pathways to moving gradually along that ladder to find better ecological outcomes. And to that end, we did actually put together a set of detailed case studies that we brought out in, I think, August 23. And this includes 7 case studies from around the world in the countries you see there on that, where there has been a shift towards enhanced equity. So there has been a move up that ladder to enhance the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in conservation. And we show the kind of dynamics that have enabled that, the barriers that they've had to overcome, and the governance qualities being put in place, and how that has then influenced social and ecological outcomes in those cases. So this actually came out before the main analysis, but we hope now that it might be used as examples and case studies to elaborate the findings that we have from this large-scale review as well. And we put that out through IUCN, and that was very much targeted at more of a practitioner audience than just an academic publication, for which, well, as we've put together in this data set, there are many case studies out there that can add detail to. Additionally, there was recently some CBD meetings in Nairobi, so we've tried to put this message out with its policy relevance to those circles, and we co-authored an IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas issued paper, Advancing Equitable Governance and Area Conservation, that was led by Phil Franks, who was a member of the Cesab Blue Justice team. And there you see on the right, that's the latest publication. So thank you very much. And we look forward to discussing and answering any questions. Unless, Brendan, do you have anything to add?
That was perfect, Neil.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk. So now we're going to have the time for questions and answers. So maybe you can stop sharing your screen so that we see everybody. And so this is how we're going to do it. People who want to ask questions, please raise your hands, and it should line you up as your hands are raised, and I will distribute the speech. I will let you know who can ask questions first. And we will also take a couple questions from the chat. Maybe Nicola will help me with this. So yeah, does anyone want to ask a question?
Well, I mean, I'll break the ice. There is a question in the chat, and that's a very important one. Is what is a positive outcome for you in terms of ecology and in terms of social outcomes? How do you define a positive outcome?
That's right. Answer that now, or do you want to take more questions?
Yes. Just answer it, and then we switch.
Do you want to take it, Neil, or I go?
Sure, I can answer that. So we try to include a broad range of ways that people define conservation effectiveness or ecological outcomes. And you have to draw a line of what represents an outcome and what you can't include. So we used one papers that report on biophysical change. They're actually monitoring a change in biodiversity or forest cover change, those kind of biophysical indicators, and studies that only incorporated those were 22% of the sample. Then there's also studies that the paper over there that look at human behavior impacting biodiversity or perceptions about biodiversity change. So we included those as well. And I think there was about 42% of the sample that included those. But then there's quite a number of studies cover both as well. So then the other 36% cover both of those. So it's over in summary, over half of the studies look at biophysical change in indicators, and another half or so look at perceptions and indicators about human activity change.
Maybe add to that, and this is probably some of the limits of these type of exercises like synthesis work, and we're stuck with existing data, right?
Yeah.
And so we had to, of course, like Neil said, draw a line somewhere. But it very much comes down to whenever the authors themselves were highlighting or reporting positive outcomes, whether ecological or social. And then in order to make sure that we have the same understanding, we tried to include that in our review protocol. So initially, at the early days of the reviewing, we would take out examples of what we think would reflect the reporting of positive outcomes. And that would then be used in a sort of collective training exercises that we did in order to align the way in which we were including papers or not, and the way in which we then were reporting that the outcomes in our data set. So that's the way in which we try to deal with that issue. But yeah, there's definitely a limit there to the type of approach related to synthesis work.
Okay, thank you very much. So there's a question here from David.
Thank you very much. Let me introduce myself first. So I'm David Obura. I'm a coral reef scientist based in Kenya, working on climate change and with small-scale fisheries. So very interested in the topic of your study as well. I'm also chairing the IPBES right now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And the topic of your synthesis group is absolutely front and center in what IPBES tries to do and our conceptual model and so on. So very excited to hear your results because they're so consistent. I had to plug, of course, looking at yourselves and your group, none of you have really been involved in IPBES assessments, at least as far as the values assessment, perhaps particularly, which overlapped with your work period, which is understandable. But we really, really depend on excellent publications and prior syntheses like yours as well. So, having involvement from your teams in the synthesis, in the assessment work we do is really valuable, because it also brings in the learning that you've had that don't necessarily go into the papers in terms of bringing things together. And we do have some upcoming assessments coming up on spatial planning and connectivity, which we'll be calling for authors, I think, in early 2026, and the second global assessment early next year. So please do consider, and particularly your developing region participants who already have some experience and can be really valuable members of teams are very important for that. So a couple of questions I have. It's interesting that you found not much detail on the why of conservation actions. I guess that is an illustration of the bias of those doing the studies, because it's sort of an assumed why these things are being done. And of course, that's important. I'm really fascinated by the very clear impact of the IPLC roles, but particularly that I guess it's your type 5 was the most positive in terms of primary control. So IPLC is knowledge holders and with primary control, as opposed to being fully autonomous. I wonder if you can comment on that. One, the cases that had negative outcomes and why. And then also this issue that it's not about being completely separate and autonomous, but it's a very interconnected world now, and perhaps all planning has to be integrated with very clear acknowledgement of primary rights of territorial holders and so on the ground. And then lastly, I'm wondering if you're linking this into the other effective conservation measures that are growing in IUCN and also the CBD, because of course your results are very important for that. And a particular take I have on other effective conservation measures is that in a way, the process acknowledges the conservation benefits from other activities, no matter what the interest of the stakeholders are. But I think it would be really interesting to have a much more direct acknowledgement of the primary interest of the activity. So community and indigenous rights and control and conservation sort of being as important as a conservation outcome. So the social outcomes are very important to acknowledge in OECMs, not just that they have conservation outcomes no matter what the original intention is. So thank you, but great studies.
Thanks, David.
Thank you very much, David. Yeah. Brendan, do you want to?
Yeah, on the values assessment, there's two people in our team specifically, Adrian Martin and Unai Pascual, who were both very much involved in the values assessment. So we have links with IPES. We could probably have more, but yeah, we're trying to make that link. And as well in the CBD and the substack groups in the CBD, there's some liaison there. So we've tried to bring that in, and as Neil was saying during the presentation, we've tried to do several efforts in not just publishing academic papers, but also sort of targeting IUCN journals and publications, because we wanted to target practitioners or hybrid profiles, even though it's not always. Well, you could argue that IUCN is also read by academics mostly, but that's a different problem. Yeah, on type 5, I think what's also worth noting is that there's actually the mixed results in there that are most prevalent. It's not just that the positive ones are and I think in these mixed results, probably we have most of the interesting information. It's not at the two extremes of that magnitude. It's actually in the mixed cases that we can learn practically from what is happening on the ground. So, yeah, and in one of the early papers in Ecology and Society, we're going through, and perhaps this taps into the question on the chat, how certain findings relate to certain incentives. We identified a bunch of conditions of why that was specific. I'll let you take the social outcomes, Neil. You have a better view on this with IUCN.
Sure. You mean sorry, repeat the question.
Sorry, the way I phrased it was that in a way, I think other effective conservation measures is perhaps the most important category for moving forward in terms of area-based conservation, but needing much more validation of the social intent as well and the social values in areas that may be considered as OECMs, not just the conservation values.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. And I think it's interesting that often the social outcomes of conservation might be defined in very material ways. And we kind of include a spectrum of definition of what those social outcomes are. We're very pleased to find that quite a lot of the sample use, quite a broad definition of well-being. So look into cultural impacts and epistemic justice and those types of issues related to communities, and not simply the material impacts, where it's very easy to show if you have a payments for environmental services scheme, you're giving people money, so look, they are better off because they have received payments. So yeah, there was a broad range of social outcomes that were measured, and I think looking into those could help define certain indicators there. We are trying to link to some of those indicator debates that are going on about the global biodiversity framework at the minute. One of those particularly is around, can we better define or categorize protected areas, for example, protected and conserved areas, to reflect the kind of ladder that we put there, so that they have some better indication of equitable governance within their definition, because at the minute the categories just such as state-led, community-led, private protected areas, they don't necessarily tell you much about the extent of influence that communities have within that. So some subcategories for those might help kind of unlock some monitoring, if you like, to look at how effective different types of initiative.
Thank you. So I guess there are a few interesting questions in the chat. Nico, do you want to select for?
Well, yes, Stephanie, she's on.
Hi, Steph.
Hi.
Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, again. Thanks a lot. Very, very interesting study. I'll present myself as well. I'm actually the former postdoc of the Blue Justice Cesab project that is still going on. I'm now a researcher at IRD, working on small-scale fisheries in Madagascar, basically. And so, yeah, my question is, so yeah, you found like positive outcomes of fully indigenous people governance and negative ones. Did you highlighted some processes by which, or context and patterns for which, like, in which you could find those positive outcomes and those negative ones? What led to, yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, it's hard to generalize too much. Each case has its own context, but I know, for example, where there was full autonomy for a local community, but negative outcomes come. Sometimes it's because there has been a rapid switch. A community has gained control over its resources, but perhaps there's conflict between different institutions and there's a lack of cohesion locally. So, and there's not a really established authority. So things become very individualized within communities and you have dynamics that don't work. So effectively the local governance qualities are not sufficient to generate those positive ecological outcomes. So there's not effective stewardship, or maybe knowledge has not been transferred. So there's the youth are not engaged within those programs. There can be many reasons why the outcomes are not positive in every case.
But we did try and what we call the governance pathways, and it's not like a quantifiable trend, but we try and identify a bunch of conditions, political conditions that were present in much of the cases that reported positive or negative outcomes. We did the same for the negative ones, like what was not working there, what was creating the political condition. For example, the fact that tenure rights were absent in many cases had a very important impact on the way in which conservation was happening. Even when there was supposedly local control, the lack of tenure rights being recognized, legally speaking, was a barrier to. That's just one example, but this one of the papers is actually outlining 6 broad governance pathways through which certain outcomes occur. And it's both the advantage and the disadvantage of our approaches, is that we can have a very sort of robust, quantitative showing that relationship, and then combining with a deep qualitative focus on cases and identify these things. That's an advantage, but it doesn't have the same robustness and it doesn't have the same leverage, and scientifically speaking. But yeah, that's basically what we tried to combine.
Thanks very much. Are there any questions? There are some in the chat. I had one myself, actually. There's also Bruno. Maybe I'm going to let Bruno ask his question. And let's try to kind of keep the questions going so that we can favor a maximum amount of questions. Be a bit more synthetic, perhaps. Thank you.
Yes. Hi, thank you very much. Very interesting. I was wondering how you can transpose what you found with indigenous people in continents such as Europe, where indigenous people are very few, if I count well. And so do your findings can transpose in such a place? I mean, the feelings of injustice in conservation are very strong in Europe. If we think, for example, the terms and the discussions about the ongoing elections, European elections right now, it's an important topic. So I was wondering if we could draw some conclusions from what you've done in Europe?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, there are certainly still a number of cases from Europe, and also our definition of indigenous peoples and local communities is quite broad. So the majority of those, even the local community part, if they're non-indigenous, are still considered as traditional communities with customary knowledge and forms of governance. But there are quite a few that we included that are local communities who don't have perhaps those traditional ties and might be more modern, diverse communities. It might be the communities of refugees or migrants and the likes as well. So there are a lot of cases of non-indigenous communities and people with different types of values who put together forms of governance that work for local communities. And I think there are certainly lessons for European policy even where those traditional ties to land have long been lost. So yeah, there's numerous examples that could be brought out from the data set, and perhaps look in and pick out those European cases would be quite interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Well, the question that I haven't answered as well.
Well, are there any other questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I had an issue with my headset. There are some questions. Francisca, would you like to show up and ask your question directly?
Yeah,
Hi.
of course.
Hi,
Hi.
Francisca.
Thank you very much. That was really insightful. I just wondered if you have engaged in any way in the biodiversity credit schemes that are currently being developed. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I think your work would be really, really relevant there because I've seen so many discussions on inclusion of IPLCs, and the vast majority of that is around having them kind of just as stakeholders or financial beneficiaries, but not really in a leading capacity. So having your work to support that argument that we basically can't just say, oh, you make some money and then you make sure that some of the money goes to local communities and then everything is okay. I think that's really important. Often arguments that are made are not really supported by scientific evidence, but more coming from a kind of what is right in an ethical sense. So I think giving that kind of weight to the argumentation would be really important. I'm happy to put you in contact with some people if you are interested in engaging in that.
I don't think we looked at it specifically. What we did do is early on in the project, we had a small subsample. We did a bit of a test run for certain methods that we were using, and in which we highlighted, I think, what we called the failed promise of benefit sharing. I said benefit sharing has been a thing for a while now under different names. And my understanding is that the credit scheme is another form of that benefit sharing, right? And that very much it is inhibited. There's barriers to to benefit sharing producing effective outcomes because a whole set of other things. And these are run very similarly to some of the things we have identified as being barriers to effective participation or to effective involvement. And these are not necessarily related to the scheme as such, but a whole bunch of other things. So yeah, we didn't look at the schemes that much, but some of the things we did probably inform it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the biodiversity credits literature is maybe a bit new, even for us. Time goes on, there's a bit of a lag. Our sample ends of publications in 2020, and I think there's been quite a lot produced since then. Now, one of our co-authors actually on the Ecology and Society paper, Robin Loveridge, is working heavily on biodiversity credits as well. So I know that he's using some of that analysis and their work through. He works for the biodiversity consultancy.
Oh, that's good to know. Yeah. I'm
But
glad.
it would definitely be useful if you have contacts and ways that we could try to bring this in to biodiversity credits processes. That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I also see it with restoration, something that I've moved to work more specifically on restoration debates now, and in the CBD policies, for example, questions of equity and local empowerment are talked about in different language, and it is much more about engaged communities in these quite vague principles about there should be participation again, and it's kind of repeating old rhetoric that I think could be more progressive.
Yeah, definitely. I'll put you in touch with some people. I think now is the moment to engage because like intergovernmental bodies are developing kind of high-level principles right now. So yeah, if you can bring some of that in, that would be really good.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we decided that we were gonna let the session roll on until maybe 15 past 12 maximum. So go on if you have questions.
We're still waiting for the jokes, Nicolas.
Yeah, we just escaped the cathedral ringing. We've been closing the windows, so no jokes. I just want to go and share that Francesca, she's the PI of the group Impact, which is actually gathering at the Cesab. So you're very welcome to get in touch all together. Yes, and there was some. So I mean, there is another question by David. So go ahead, David. You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering, given a bit of time, so what next? What do you do after synthesis results like this in terms of priorities for research or for developing standards or whatever it might be? Where do you go with this?
You want to talk about the monitoring, Neil?
Sure. Yeah, I think to go on, not to do another systematic review is the answer. So yeah, we one of the areas we've tried to look at relating to the CBD global biodiversity framework and discussions around monitoring for that now is to try to explore how much monitoring is already being done by Indigenous peoples and local communities. And so we set about a little task that was supported by the Forest Peoples Programme and International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity to explore what extent and type of monitoring is already being done by local communities that captures many of these factors that we're talking about in our synthesis and could potentially be scaled up to be used for effective monitoring, rather than this kind of top-down, globally debated indicators. And is there scope for more bottom-up monitoring initiatives? That's one direction we've taken this in. And then the other is, as I said before, kind of working on those protected area categories and ways that monitoring could be improved to capture these facets without everybody having to agree, yes, we're going to monitor justice, because that's just never going to happen at an international level, is it? People say, okay, yes, we accept all these indicators for rights and justice to be brought in. So I don't have much faith in the international processes of progressing that far.
Yeah.
All right.
Let me just highlight that this is where we also make the link with our original sort of where we come from, the environmental justice literature, where a lot in the past has been about communities themselves collecting data and generating data to make up for blind spots in how scientists, us, and policymakers are monitoring certain things. And this is where the environmental justice world meets conservation field in a sense in its data collection stage, I guess. But this is a very early on project.
Okay, I have one question, if I may, and then maybe Nico will have one last question as well, and then I think I'm going to close the session because it's the time is running. So my question, I think, is very naive, so excuse me in advance for it. But like, is there a way, or do you think that it would be interesting to look at a correlation between like the time that a study would take to, like actually go from the moment where it's conceptualized to the moment where the conservation issues are applied to some extent? And do you think there would be a difference in the time it takes to do this when you involve local communities, and like to which extent? So I'm going to try to develop what I'm thinking a little bit, is that like the more stakeholders you have, the longer it might take. And maybe it'll be more efficient if you also leave the autonomy to the local people to do their things. Or is that like not relevant because it depends on the question that you're asked? I don't know. I don't know if my question is relevant, but I was wondering about that.
No,
is it clear?
Yeah, it is. It is. It's a very interesting point, and I think it depends on the history of that each particular context and community in a way. And we show through those policy matters case studies, sometimes you can have a sudden, for example, the National Court recognizes local forest customary institutions, and suddenly where a community was excluded and it was part of a state-led protected area, suddenly the community is in control. And it can be very, very rapid because they have their indigenous institutions and the community is very cohesive, traditional values have been passed on, and they can suddenly accept ownership and manage it very well. It can be that flip. But in other cases, particularly where there's like a complex collaborative governance and lots of actors, and there's been a loss of trust and difficulties, you might have to have this kind of long-term conflict reconciliation process to even for those actors to begin working effectively together again. And so sometimes it's a real, decades long process of trying to bring that back and form an effective governance and working relationships. So let's say it really depends. And there's no prescription. There's no way you can say this is the approach, follow the handbook, and it applies everywhere. Yeah.
It's not naive. I think we tested that in the regression analysis, right? The influence of the temporal element. And I don't think it came out as having much effect. But it hints at a bigger question, which this works also inform is the issue of trade-offs, right? Whether it's time-based or whether it's resource-based, but it informs a broader discussion on trade-offs that are generated by the environmental policy in general, and this is very much present in public debates. So it adds to that. If it how long is too much time, right? If it produces more effective outcomes, right?
Definitely. Okay. Nico, did you want to? Yeah.
Yes, I do that. So, I want to, thanks everyone for having me here today. We were almost 70, and there are still 20, almost 30 people still connected. So that's really, illustrate the interest of the population and the people. And so thank you so much, everyone, for having me here. I've got two specific questions which we want to ask to every group. What is a Cesabinar? So there's a question for you, Brendan, and for you now. So what is the magic trick or the rule of thumb, for you, Brendan, to keep the dynamic of your group going on during the almost 5 years of the project? And for me, you now, it's going to be, do you have some advice for former and current postdoc Cesab? such as how to handle that, postdoc setup position, which is quite different from a classical postdoc. So first, Brendan, give us the magic tricks for us to share with the books.
Oh, my magic trick was Neil. So my recommendation is find a really good postdoc. Now, more seriously, I think the dynamic between Neil and I was pretty much what kept us going in the difficult moments of COVID, where the whole group was scattered around the world and everyone was doing their things and, taking care of their families and whatnot. And Neil and I trying to keep on working and trying and keep on advancing, the two of us, and then each of us sort of related to different group members. And I think our dynamic, the two of us, was very key in keeping the group going. So I don't know if that's the magic bullet, but it really helped us in keeping us together now.
Thank you. And so the postdoc follows you now.
No, that is very true. I mean, you saw that timeline. We kind of put our search together and got those 70,000 publications like a couple of weeks before the first lockdown came, and then we were stuck. And we both had young children. It was difficult to kind of keep those ambitions going, but we were able to kind of WhatsApping each other and making sure that we were just plodding at the right times, and we had each other to bounce ideas off and problem solve as we went on, even when we weren't allowed to meet up. And other members of the group for whom it wasn't their priority are difficult to engage at different times as well. So having that kind of just continued slow progress through that time and finding support in other areas was really crucial. But then that's like reforming of the group with those 5 young researchers was a real boost when we had all those papers to plug into. So having that ability to adapt, and it was great that Cesab were supportive in that, and had seen that some of the members of the group just weren't able to engage. We kept having group members that were being promoted. They were getting too important to be part of the Cesab activities in a way. So yeah, that really worked.
Well, I would say thank you very much. I mean, I've got tons of questions actually, but I'll keep them for when you'll be coming back at Cesab. I'm sure it will happen, and I let Camille and that session. Thank you again very much for presenting your work today, and thank you for the one who are still connected.
Yes, thank you very much. It was really interesting, and I'm happy to have this opportunity to meet you at least virtually. Thank you everybody else for attending, and we'll keep you posted on the next webinar. So the next one should be on September 19th, and it will be made by Isabelle Coudon, who is part of the Review team. And so we will communicate about this, but it will be on September 19th at 2 p.m. Paris time. Thank you very much. And I think this was a very successful first Cesabinar, and I hope that we will keep the momentum and enthusiasm growing and going. Bye. And thank you very much to the support team, Maud and Nicolas Cazel-Silva.
Yeah. And thank you for special dedicace to Bruno Fadi, the former scientific president of the scientific council of the Cesab. He's been supporting Cesab since the beginning, and I miss me so much. I miss you so much, but it's still great seeing you today.